will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon, and of your possessions and the other territories to any of them belonging or pertaining.
In the homesteads of the colony, on the wide, cool verandas, away from the burning rays of the tropical sun, whole families gathered to listen to the coronation. But ever present, even in Nairobi, was the overbearing sense of danger, even on Coronation Day. But the Mau Mau has absorbed only a section of the people. Many of the Kikuyu are loyal, and speaking for them all was Chief Makime, his bodyguard at his side.
Mathina maria twina mo guku bururi wa Kenya ina thina bururi wa Kenya handu haria ngwaria handu haria ega othe Ngai niateithie muthamaki.
I am a Kikuyu chief. There have been many troubles in Kenya, which many of us don't like. I now speak for all loyal Africans. God save the Queen.
Ngai niateithie muthamaki.
Nina thiko ithatu tuona ciana cikĩrĩranĩra mũirĩtu ũmwe nĩakuire.
In 1953, I was a teenager in London and watched the coronation on TV. But when I took this photo, a few years later, I was living in Canada. One of life's accidents. I only went to Canadian immigration in 1956 because the queue at New Zealand House was too long. Yet, why emigrate from England? Many reasons. A desire to escape a country exhausted by its history? Yes. But perhaps above all, it was the look in an African's eyes in the early afternoon of May the 1st, 1955. Or so hindsight tells me. Another accident. I was conceived in Scotland, but was born in London. And as Don McCullen, the photographer, wrote, like all my generation in London, I am a product of Hitler. I was born in the 30s and bombed in the 40s. Following World War II at my Jesuit school, I was excited by British history. All the pink parts were ours. I learnt about our heroes. 600 of them especially thrilled me. The Light Brigade that charged so foolishly and bravely into the Valley of Death at Balaclava. They epitomized Englishness, courage, calmness, and self-belief against all odds, a firm hand when needed. Such Englishness became part of a colonial and imperial spirit that dominated the world and which were presented as the white man's burden, and something glorious both in my education and the popular media.
Ngai mũmbi wa igũrũ na thĩ, Ngai mũthũra muoyo, mũtangĩri na mũiguathi.
Now imagine a different story. The stillness of an unwound clock. But memory stirs and winds the clock as far back as one can remember. Because in this story there are no glass cases, and the outer reaches of memory are the limits of history. History is what is remembered and spoken.
In the fiery dawn of time, when the earth trembled in the throes of creation, a dense cloud of mist stood over the land as Mugai, the divider of the universe, descended to earth, to his seat of mystery. There, upon the dazzling snow-capped peaks of the black crystal mountain called Kirinyaga, he made a dwelling place. And from that day, the mountain became his chief abode and was revered as sacred ground. According to the Kikuyu legend, Mugai led Kikuyu, father of the Kikuyu nation, to the misty peaks of the sacred mountain. Pointing out the beauty of the land lying below, he said, "You shall carve your inheritance from this land. It shall belong to you and to your children's children, to be passed on from generation to generation until the twilight of existence." And so it became. The Agikuyu were given the land of rivers and ravines, of hills and valleys, of forests, with all the creatures therein and all the gifts of nature that Mugai, the divider of the universe, had bestowed on his people. As the morning sun broke through the misty skies, Gikuyu did as his creator had commanded him. He descended to Mukuru wa Nyagathaga, where a sacred grove of fig trees stood in rich red earth. Resting in the shade of the sacred grove, he found the most beautiful of women, and taking her for his wife, he named her Mobi, the creator or molder of the Kikuyu nation. From the sacred Mukuyu grove, Gikuyu took his name. Together, Gikuyu and Mombi built a home. They gave birth to 9 daughters. Wakinya moshesho wa Mobi, wetane Mobi, moshosho ne wa airetu kenda kou kwa Mobi, wajiro waboi wajiko, wangare washera wairimo, wangoi wangeshi wambura airetu kenda kou kwa Mobi.
In 1990, a friend of mine found 150 lantern slides in a street market in London, England. They are photographs of East Africa in the 1920s and had been hand-tinted. Now, 80 years later, the tinting has faded and the emulsion has bubbled and boiled. We can guess at the reasons for some of these fugitive images. But who the persons were, Africans or Europeans, is unknown. Their identities and their stories are hidden from us, not just by the passage of time, but by the inevitable physical decay of the photograph. But they are part of the record of 80 years of British rule, as white settlers were given the land of hills and valleys, of forests with all the creatures therein, and all the gifts of nature at Mugai.
And all the gifts of nature that Mugai, the divider of the universe, had bestowed on his people. And so, it became.
Numbers, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Now I present 1.
In my youth, all Britons did national service. 2 years for Queen and country.
Upright and alert, they're beginning to
I
acquire-
enjoy being upright and alert, but I'm skeptical when told to be an officer for the Queen is the greatest honour that can befall an Englishman. One of the good things about national service was that it cut, as we said then, your mother's apron strings. I reject a posting to the War Office in London, complete with civilian dress and living at home. I want adventure. So instead, I'm in Africa, in Kenya Colony. A rather cushy number, a clerical job at General Headquarters East Africa Command, on the edge of Nairobi. I fall in love with Africa and buy a camera to record my African life. I take around 1,000 photographs. These photographs are an incomplete record of 18 months from 1954 to 1956. There is also the record of my memory, but that, like forgetfulness, is apt to be inventive. At weekends we go exploring, and on my leaves I hitchhike in Kenya and Tanganyika. I get to Zanzibar. It is the Garden of Eden, and I think I will come here on my retirement. Over the years, my memories, perhaps influenced by these photographs, became black and white. In vain, I tried to recall the colours of my East Africa. And I've also realised that what I saw through the viewfinder was not necessarily what the camera saw. That machine indifferent to my perception of events. I often stared at these images of myself, trying to find what is hidden in the emulsion, I was left only with a non-recognition. Sometimes I would wonder if I had ever been in East Africa. But one day in the late 1990s, when looking at film footage of East Africa in an archive in London, I was astonished to find myself alive, moving, in colour, and of course, taking pictures. This fragment of colour film was a proof that I had been there in Kenya so long ago. Inside, I was trembling, and I knew I must return to East Africa and the far country of that May afternoon in Indaya Gorge. It's a 24-hour low-altitude flight to Kenya. Do I imagine that I see the pyramids? But I don't imagine my arrival. Standing astonished and a little embarrassed in a military truck as we are driven through a Nairobi completely cordoned with British troops. Thousands of Africans are arrested as the authorities try to sweep Nairobi clean of Mau Mau.
Fear of the fanatical, death-dealing Mau Mau society grips Kenya, prized possession in Britain's East African Empire. In Nairobi, the colony's capital, police and British troops round up hundreds of suspected members of the terrorist band. A native chieftain loyal to the British is a victim of the Mau Mau's bloody rampage to drive all white men from Kenya. This is the dead chief.
From the Cathedral of the Highlands in Nairobi are borne the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Roger Ruck and their 6-year-old son, Michael, a British family brutally murdered by the Mau Mau. But the Mau Mau strike not only at Europeans, their own people are often among their victims, that so many Africans were reluctant to talk for fear of the Mau Mau's revenge. For even one of their own tribe may well be a member of the gang. A black cloud of suspicion hangs over all in Kenya, and until the Mau Mau are destroyed, the innocent, too, must suffer.
As I looked at these images, often ambiguous, from colonial times, I saw that they are only the surface. Underneath, there are many layers. I realized that I knew very little about what happened in Kenya, despite my having been there. And then I wondered if it were possible that I had walked down one of these colonial streets in 1955, at the same moment as, say, a colonial administrator and 2 others, an Asian and an African, a Mau Mau. So 4 stories, different points of the compass. Ashru Kapila was born in India in 1926, and his family emigrated to Kenya in 1930. His father was a lawyer.
Also followed his footsteps and qualified as a lawyer in 1947. I was called to the bar in England, and I flew back. In fact, flying was a novelty at that time. My parents were very nervous about my flying back, but we could not come by boat because I could not get a seat in a cabin unless I found 3 other Indians to share it with. In England, if I traveled in a bus, the passenger sitting next to you stood up, preferred to stand throughout the journey, cut you. Things like that. There was a color bar, a rigid color bar, where the races lived in separate compartments. And there were separate residential areas, clubs, schools, hotels, restaurants, even buses. You traveled in a different section. That bred in you a sense of resentment, naturally. Somehow, before I left for England, we sort of tended to accept it. There was a sufficient large Indian community, and one was happy and content in it. But I think partly the legal education, which has inherent in it the basic principle that all men are equal, that they have equal rights. And my experience in England, where surprisingly the slightest bit of discrimination touched you much more than this wholesale discrimination in Kenya, which we had silently accepted. The Indians were claiming equality with the whites at that stage. I don't think fully aware that the same right extended to the African. It's only in the 40s, when there was sufficient development of the African, that sections of the Indians, not all of them, began to identify with the African.
Africans fought in both world wars and watched their masters, the white man, busily at work massacring one another. They are no longer willing to take last place. This grove of sacred fig trees is of central importance in the life of Mweria Juma, a Kikuyu. He took the Mau Mau oath, fought against the British, and became Major Ruku.
Gaguthie mutito andu airu othe aruia mbara ni twateire ibande iria twari nacio ritwa ria mundu tutingiendire ritwa rimenyeke mundu akeita nie ngeita Ruku riria ndari mutito wira wakwa wari wa guthondeka bunduki na ndarikia guthondeka bunduki ndanengera muthigari uria utari na bunduki kiria getumire hurane na murungu wa mbere ni kuona githaka kiria matutunyite kuria kwetagwo White Highland bururi uria arungu megaire ati ndatwikaniria kuno nganyitwo na ngacitangwo kanyanga ati ni ndatwikaniria githaka giake na uguo nikio giatumire tumenane na jigue ngoro yakwa uru angikorwo mundu ni agucitangira kanyanga ni ndu wa gukinya bururi wakwa na ni kundunya ndunyite.
My name is John Nottingham. I was born in England in 1928 and educated there. I first came out to Kenya by ship and arrived in Mombasa on the 31st of December 1952. What brought me to Kenya? Well, you have to do something. And with the background of my father, I think the colonial service was not altogether a surprising one to choose. There was a sort of myth of wild animals and wide open spaces in the Kenya image, which there wasn't in West Africa. I don't think there was anything else to it than that. I didn't know very much about it. I knew roughly where it was on the map. I didn't know anything at all about its history, and I knew nothing at all about its geography as such.
Jomo Kenyatta, a Kikuyu, led Kenya to independence in 1963. He once observed that the Africans had owned the land. The missionaries came and taught the African about the Christian God. Now, the Africans had the Christian God, and the white man owned the land. The Kikuyu are the largest of Kenya's 42 tribes, and white farms were mostly on land the Kikuyu believed to be theirs. Kenyatta, a moderate, sought land and independence through peaceful means. Other Kikuyu chose violence and formed the Kenya Land Freedom Army, or Mau Mau. The government arrested Kenyatta, alleging that he was the head of the Mau Mau. Asru Kapila was one of the lawyers who defended Kenyatta.
And we decided to bring out an English QC to lead us. Apart from that, in any case, not many other lawyers would have been keen to act in it. No, certainly no European lawyer would have acted. But I was associated in many eyes, especially in the eyes of the whites, as being a sympathizer of Mau Mau, that he's a supporter. And there were repercussions over a period of time. Those really don't matter. They come from people who do not understand the position, and they do not understand the function of a lawyer anyway. But quite apart from that, I did not believe he was guilty. The 6 accused who were assembled from different parts of the country had no connection They're from different tribes.
Jomo Kenyatta was found guilty by Judge Thacker and spent 8 years in prison. He and the other 5 defendants were victims of perjured evidence, bought with bribery by the colonial government, who also paid Judge Thacker £20,000 for his services.
Yes, I was a district officer in the Colonial Administrative Service.
Now, what does that mean, a district officer?
I suppose it means that you're going to rule people in some sort of way. I hoped it would also turn out to make me a sort of secular missionary as well.
Harĩ ngoro-inĩ yakwa rĩ, tũrĩ andũ a mũhĩrĩga, kũngĩagĩire na ũndũ ũgũtũma tũke haha tũrĩ athuuri a mũhĩrĩga tũhoe Ngai. Tuokaga haha akorwo nĩ mĩrimũ ĩrĩkuo, akorwo nĩ ũtonga tũkwenda kũhoya kũrĩ Ngai. Ũndũ ũcio nĩguo warĩ wa athuuri acio a tene arĩa matũciarĩte, tũgakaranga maguta, twarĩkia gũkaranga maguta, nĩ kũrĩ nyama iria twamũraga cia gũtigĩrwo Ngai, ciaigagwo harĩa gatagatĩ ka mũtĩ ũrĩa, na riko rĩgakorwo rĩ haha gatagatĩ, haha he mbembe, nĩo twacinagĩra nyama. Andũ othe arĩa a mũhĩrĩga rĩu tũkara haha tũrĩ ithuothe. Nĩ gũtongoria andũ na ndĩmonie ũrĩa tũkũruta igongona rĩa kũhoya Ngai. No rĩu andũ a matukũ maya gũtirĩ ũngĩkwĩra nĩ yake.
This Sicario soldier runs messages and makes tea in my workplace. Since whites think of Africans as children, he is also my boy. That is, he does my laundry, including starching my uniform. Even though I pay him, it doesn't seem right to me. I wonder why he is a soldier. He is puzzled by the question. He tells me he is against the Mau Mau. He is uncomfortable when I try to get an opinion from him about the whites. This is the camp cinema, which I run. 1 show a week, Monday. Whites only, of course. I don't choose the films. In the African quarters, it's slapstick and adventures, such as cowboys shooting Indians. I smuggle into our cinema 2 African Education Corps Sergeant Majors. They watch the films unseen through the small windows of the projection booth. An unforgettable moment, a rude awakening from these 2 Africans. It's the first time they watch a Hollywood gangster flick. Afterwards, these 2 Africans tell me that they are interested by 2 things: seeing white men killing each other so freely, and that there are whites doing things they thought only blacks do, such as cleaning the streets.
In the settlers' houses, doors and windows are barred and bolted, where once they were never closed. And at sundown, the once trusted Kikuyu servants must leave the premises. They may be loyal, they may be traitors who would let the enemy in.
I have no contact with settlers in the White Highlands. There are those who come to town with pistols slung low, the Kenya cowboys. Then there are the urban settlers, immigrants in search of the good life. I fantasize almost to the day I return to England about taking local release and becoming a settler.
It was a series of shattering experiences and new relationships, new ways of looking at people, in many ways liberating, but also at the same time full of tragedies and tragic episodes. But there are obviously episodes which stick out. Immediately after the emergency began, the Kikuyu were demonized as a tribe in Kenya. And especially this took effect in the Rift Valley, where there were probably about 100,000 squatters.
Kikuyu peasants were allowed to squat on white-owned farms in exchange for their cheap labour.
So a policy decision was taken that they should be sent back to the African reserves. This had enormous effects on them, obviously, and a lot of them, I think, certainly the younger ones, went straight into the forest. In that first 6 months that I was in Nyeri, I was deputed to meet the trains and the lorries that brought these people back. They came having left practically everything behind, with a few pots and pans. They didn't know, in many cases, the places that they were supposed to be going to, their so-called homes. It was a grapes of wrath situation. I felt very, very personally affected by that.
When hitchhiking, I stay twice at a Catholic mission on the outskirts of Moshi, Tanganyika. My hosts are 2 missionaries, an American from Chicago and an Irishman. In the evening, we play cards and listen to Enrico Caruso on old 78 RPM opera recordings. The presbytery where I sleep is now a shop and a garage for the diocese. There is now a cathedral, and the old church, an AIDS clinic. I looked for the Irish priest, Father Neville, who told me he would return home to Ireland to die. But we cannot go back. Instead, he lies in the grounds of a parish and school he founded in the foothills of Kilimanjaro after 50 years in Moshi.
Twikire mukirisi mwaka wa 1937 ndikana kanini nundu wa kwiruta kirira kia Ngai kuringana ndondo aciari akwa mari a Kristiano na ndathie cukuru ni twakirutagwo uhoro wa tondu tene twakihoyaga twahoyagira migumo-ini no ni twachokire tugikihe uhoro wa Jesu Kristo arikia guciarwo nikio giatumire ati nigetha tukona muoyo mundu arikia kuma thi ino.
Kwari na tofauti ya dini ya Gikuyu ya gitene na Gikristo?
Ndari nacio cieri.
Kwari na tofauti?
Tofauti iria yonekire no kwirwo ati tondu ithuĩ twahoyaga Ngai no ni kwachokire gwituika ati Jesu ni ari mwana wa Ngai na ni wokahonokia kirindi mundu amwihoka. Uguo tofauti iria yariho ni ati ithuĩ twahoyaga Ngai uria Ngai we mwene. Kiria giatumire bara ya thira bara iri kuo kiria giatumire turegane na Ukristo ni ati murungu uria wokite aria mokire guku thiini wa misheni aria marehire uhoro wa Ngai no mo machokire magitutunya migunda kieni giki makigia na migunda na ni undu ucio rira twambiriirie bara ni twariganirwo ni uhoro wa Ukristo uria matuhunjiirie na tukiingira bara-ini no bara yarikia guthira na twachokerio bururi witu wachokio na marikia kwehuta ni tuonire turumanirire na uhoro wa Ngai. Gitumi ni ati twathikiriria nduriri ciothe cia thi mundu mugi gutire mundu tagwetaga Jesu Kristo ati ni muhonokia na ni okire na tondu kundu guku guthiagwo ni tuonire ati mundu no muhaka mundu erire ari guku thiri tukiuga ni tugucokerera njira iyo.
In 1954, immediately after that repatriation of the squatters, the British gathered the Kikuyu into large villages. By the end of 1955, 1 million Kikuyu live in 800 villages overseen by the Loyalist Home Guard. The British have imprisoned more than 90% of the Kikuyu. Despite all the happy pictures of life behind the wire, the villages were often places of hunger, beatings, rape and murder by the security forces, white and black alike. Villagization is not a new strategy. It was successfully used by Britain in its Malayan colony and is also the template for the American strategic hamlets in Vietnam.
It was an African society that had been subjected to enormous changes very, very quickly, and which was now in the midst of its most traumatic experiences, the emergency in which it was facing the British Army, the settlers, colonial government and its police force, and its own people, who were divided in a way that they had never been divided before.
6718, John Jimo.
The government forms a paramilitary home guard of African loyalists, eventually numbering 25,000. The core of the home guard are Christian Kikuyu. Loyalists are given property and land seized from suspected Mau Mau supporters.
Rĩrĩa mũrũngũ anyingatire ngiuma bũrũri-inĩ kuga kwa mũciĩ na ngĩtiga indo ciakwa ciothe nginya ng'ombe ngĩthiĩ gũtũũra mũtitũ ta hiti. Hau nĩ anyongereire kũmũrũra mũno tondũ nĩ ndonire nĩ thũ yakwa akandigithania na mũtumia wakwa na aciari akwa na mĩgũnda yakwa yothe na ng'ombe ciakwa ciothe agĩtaha agĩthiĩ nacio. Ũguo nĩ ndonire nĩ ndaiguire ũũru nĩ mũrũngũ na ngĩmũtua thũ yakwa kuma hau tondũ nĩ ndonire nĩ anjehutĩirie indo ciakwa ciothe.
I was given the job of building home guard posts. One of the most horrifying experiences I had was when I was told that one of them had been destroyed. I went out to it. It was a place called Gatambiru. And it had been burnt down, and 19 people had been killed or burnt to death. It was a fence of barbed wire around it, and none of the people inside had been able to escape. The freedom fighters were controlling the gate, but the memory of the site of that home guard post and the burnt bodies and the destruction have lived with me ever afterwards.
In the Nairobi district, a coffee planter and well-known resident of the colony was brutally murdered together with his wife and 8-year-old son. The Mau Mau terrorists, some 40 in number, were armed with pangas, homemade rifles, and an automatic weapon. The attack was made shortly after 9 o'clock.
During the 7 years of the emergency, 32 white settlers were killed and unknown thousands of Africans by both the Mau Mau and the security forces. Anywhere between the official figure of 12,000 and 200,000. Nagana Melancheli and her African cook, Mweru, are shot and pangaed on April 25, 1953 by a gang of 20 Mau Mau. Melancheli's children, aged 15 and 10, are also killed. They have only been in Kenya 10 days. I have been in Kenya 6 months, as yet untouched by the emergency, dancing on the surface, as it were. Until one night, I am babysitting, looking after 2 small children. The Mau Mau attack the house next door. Just me and a pistol between the children and whatever is happening next door. After they kill the African servants and cooks, the Mau Mau leave. The whites are untouched, but I do not know these events then, and I'm left immobile, in the silence until the parents return. To my amazement and horror, they do not seem concerned by what has happened. The The soldiers at GHQ are called out from time to help the infantry. They call us the pen pushers. Most times nothing much happens. We struggle not to get lost in bamboo forest or stand ready while police search African homes for Mau Mau and weapons, or sweep up a valley in a dogleg formation. But one time, on May the 1st, 1955, 3 of us are perhaps the first British soldiers to face a Mau Mau gang escaping through the brush. I miss being shot by inches, but more importantly for my story, the gang of 15 are all killed. The next day, in some sort of shock, I scribble down everything that has happened. I send a long letter to my parents. Shortly after arriving in Canada, I turn the events into a short story, and then I put it all away. I never talk about it. I never wanted to say that I had shot someone. It is the late 1990s, a time for unfinished business in my life. I read the papers again and wonder if it is a feeling of guilt, even a fear of what they reveal about me, that has kept these papers in an envelope, in a box, all those years.
One should never forget that this whole Mau Mau insurrection was very much a homegrown one, unlike the Algerian or the Zimbabwean or even the South African ones, which were enormously helped from outside.
Rĩrĩa ndarĩ mũtitũ, wĩra wakwa warĩ wa gũthondeka bunduki. Na ndarĩkia gũthondeka bunduki ndanengera mũthigari ũrĩa ũtarĩ na bunduki. Arĩkia kũhũrwo agathiĩ mbara-inĩ. Mĩcinga twathondekaga nĩndakoragwo ndĩna thigari imwe cia gũicũhia itende cia mĩcinga na mĩberethi, gĩcunjĩ kĩa mũberethi kĩigana ũguo. Ndarĩkia gwĩka atĩ nĩtwagarũkanagia na gwĩkĩra nyamũ ĩno ya banjũrũ ĩno ya gwĩka atĩ ya kũnyita rithathi. Icio wĩra ũcio nĩguo ndarutaga wa kũnyitithania. Twarĩ na macini cia gũtũra marima, cia gũthegera, ngacoka ngagwatania. Ndarĩkia kũgwatania mũcinga ũcio wothe, ona ta rĩu ũngĩthiĩ museum, mĩcinga ĩyo twarĩ nayo nĩĩigĩtwo kuo, nĩyonagwo nginya ũmũthĩ.
It is something after midnight on May the 1st, 1955. A drive down into the Rift Valley. A long march interrupted to watch the African dawn. Then our destination. The place is burned in my memory. On the left, 100 yards away, a ridge, broken by a dry riverbed which deepens and separates us from the plain in front of us. In the far distance, another very high ridge. We are strung out along the edge of the riverbed. A gang of 50 Mau Mau will be driven by infantry and Kikuyu guards into our waiting rifles. There are 3 of us together, Bernie, Gordon, and myself. Our only shelter from the sun, a lone acacia. First, I look for that landscape. I cannot see it. Armed with a War Office map reading and Ordnance Survey maps, we refine our search. The area's right, but nothing is the same. Eventually, we rent a global positioning system and find the spot, and all is clear. The site of the conflict where 16 men died no longer exists. The landscape I knew has been dug up for diatomite, a constituent of both dynamite and cat litter. Perhaps it was foolish of me to think that I could stand twice in the same waters. Memory is a kind of door, and it opens onto new spaces inhabited by unforeseen people and events. This Maasai is Moses, who wants to be an airline pilot when he grows up. John Nottingham, the secular missionary. His task, to encourage Africans to put witchcraft behind them. The Africans use witchcraft and oathing to regulate tribal practices and disputes. The Mau Mau have reworked these traditional forms, and all Kikuyu take these oaths, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. The oaths carry a curse of death for those who break them.
Wrapped in the cloak of gold with the golden girdle, the queen takes the jeweled sword, the sword of justice and mercy, and offers it at the altar.
At that time, Nottingham wrote that all societies have magical beliefs and oaths. And he wondered if attacking the foundations would only succeed in bringing the house down.
Miumane tatu ya mau muma kiambiriria na muma ngero mundu atonya muma-ini ukaheo hitho ciothe cia mbara na uria ubatie kuona kindu kia mbara na uria ubatie gukorwo ukimenya ati bururi waku ni watunyirwo. Kiu nikio giatumire nyingire mau-ini ndarikia kuingira muma-ini.
I get an official copy of the Mau Mau oaths. I'm horrified by the reported bestiality, the use of blood, sex, and excreta in those ceremonies. I do not question what I read. An African assistant district officer invites me and a friend to a de-oathing ceremony. I accept excitedly, and I'm fascinated by the event. I take these photos of the expressive ritual dancing. I am not allowed to take photos of the actual de-oathing, which is ironically carried out by a loyal witch doctor. The whites believe that the Mau Mau is not a political movement. The oathing ceremonies reinforce their belief that the Africans are primitive, uncivilized, savage, and therefore scarcely human, and so may be treated brutally. This best-selling American novel and movie emphasized the British version of the oaths. The African history, given the world by colonial powers, still colors our vision of Africa.
Out of the flaming heart of the dark continent comes Mau Mau. Mau Mau, two words that mean death. Filmed under fire in the steaming jungles of East Africa, the screen rocks with the savagery, the terror, the lust of Mau Mau, the secret killer society that shocked the world.
This artwork from an Italian magazine in 1953 depicts a Mau Mau attack on two women, Kitty Hesselberger and Rains Simpson. Simpson shot one dead as he entered the living room. The attackers fled into other rooms. The two brave women continued to fire through the thin walls of the room, killing 2 more of the attackers. The Mau Mau then fled, leaving behind their shoes and traumatized household servants.
Uguo muma mau uguo kwirwo ndwari muru kana uria kweragwo ati andu nima heanaga muma na thakame ya mundu kana mundu wanja ucio ni chau hari ugikuyu thakame ya mundu wanja yari rahu tondu mundu wanja ndangihutio ni muthuriwe ari muhitanu ona thakame ya mundu wanja ndungimihutia andu airu ithuĩ tutiahũraga tiga nĩ arĩa magarũrũkĩte tondu kũrĩ maugaga magathiĩ na mũrũngũ wĩyathi tũtikaheo magathiĩ nginya Rũraya na rũngũ na mũndũ akaria ũguo mbere itũ na twĩ tĩri warĩ witũ augaga nĩ tũtigarĩtie mĩaka 100 tũgĩkeara ucio nĩwe twaiguithagia ũru tondu endaga tũtũre tũrĩ ngombo.
Now, 50 years later, there is no cast iron consensus about what really happened at the oathing ceremonies. What is fact? What is legend?
Uguo muma wale wa kuiguithania andu no gutire ciiko njuru tondu tutiakire ciana twari andu agima na ni twamenyaga uria tureka.
Perhaps one way to think about it are these words of Canon Peter Bostock of Nairobi, who wrote in January 1955 that, for the whites, the unspoken thought is, a white man would never sink so low as to do such things. How easily we forget Belsen and innumerable incidents of inhuman activities by white men during this present century.
The acts that were attributed to them, which no doubt were happening, were horrible. They could not have been justified. On the assumption, first of all, in any case, which is my belief, and that violence is not justified, that ends do not justify the means. And these means were indefensible. But perhaps in the event, things may not have moved in favor of the struggle for independence with the speed which they did, but for the Mau Mau movement.
Nonetheless, Ashru Kapila defended 500 Mau Mau. Without Kapila in the courtroom, Mau Mau suspects would refuse to testify.
It has worked in other countries. In Israel, the fight for independence employed no less violent means in the beginning, but in the end, the independence for a Jewish state was achieved by that.
But to answer that question of brutality, yes, some brutality, but nothing like the brutality that was coming from the other side. Concentration camps where people were being made to go on their knees on stones, where people were being given false shootings, to false executions, where Griffiths was going around with a Bren gun on the front of his Land Rover shooting every Kikuyu. The only good Kikuyu was a dead one, the kind of language that you heard in the Second World War about Germans.
Captain Gerald Griffiths of the King's African Rifles was the only member of the local colonial forces and police charged and found guilty of any criminal behavior during the emergency. He served 5 years for torture in an English jail. Griffiths was only the tip of the iceberg. Shortly after I arrive in Kenya, I learn that white soldiers are being paid 5 shillings for each Mau Mau they kill. Their proof and trophy is a hand of their victim. I am horrified, but I believe naively that this behavior is atypical. British soldiers just don't behave in this way. Is your belief in non-violence therefore utopian?
Oh, by no means. Gandhiji demonstrated in India, beyond any doubt. that his pacifist methods could be effective and were effective. They sounded rather bizarre. He would lay down in front of the bullets. In the end, the British had to give in to those methods. I don't think it's obligatory to employ violence to achieve your means in any situation.
The Kikuyu too have their heroes. The most feared of the freedom fighters in the forests is Dedan Kimathi. There was a story that he had been trained by communist agents in the Middle East. I believe the propaganda.
Flushed from his mountain hideout, Dedan Kimathi, last of the leaders of the dreaded Mau Mau, is wounded by native police and taken to a hospital in Nairobi. It is estimated that the self-styled field marshal had less than 300 die-hard followers at the time of his capture, remnant of a group of fanatics numbering thousands, which during the post-war years terrorized Kenya and slaughtered scores of colonists. The human leopard will roam no more.
Dedan Kimathi is hung and buried in an unmarked grave.
No toria Kenyatta arakuire tondu Kenyatta ni aruire bururi uyu miaka mingi. Uge unyinyi wake wothe akoragwo ari ruraya ari bururi wa Russia kurora uria agoka gwarana thiini wa bururi wa Kenya riria athomagira wiathi witia wiathi ukombora bururi wake.
I look for the place in the Aberdares where the self-appointed Field Marshal Kimathi was captured. In 1956, this area was covered by forest. Now it is the Nyayo T-zone. Amongst the plants is a cleared area with a small mound which marks where Kimathi was ambushed. There is no plaque. Jomo Kenyatta, unsympathetic to the violence of Mau Mau, would never grant them formal recognition or compensation. The site is kept clear by local villagers. To this day, little effort has been made to clean up the colonial inheritance of damaged tribal relations. Although Dedan Kimathi's grave has never been found, a statue was unveiled in Nairobi in December 2006. This act of remembrance is perhaps a small step towards the Kenya of Maria Juma.
Alini bururi wa Kenya ri ari guo turo wakwa ri na ri mwihoko wakwa ri thiini ni hakwa mwene ndiciragia kana kumenya gwakwa Kenya riu ni kunyitithania nduriri ciothe iria iri Kenya tondu nduriri cia Kenya ni hakuhi 42 thiini wa Kenya na nicio tuga Kenya tutondeke taifa moja ruriri rumwe tutakugweta Gikuyu kana Ikamba kana Meru kana Maasai kana Rubwa kana andu aria angi ithuothe tutuike taifa ra Kenya ni uguo niguo njui ati Kenya niguo ihana tigane ati gugikigia na anene mundu akenda akapenderea ruriri rwake rungi rwake.
Later on, when I went into the forest for the first time, into the Aberdare forests, we came across a very well organized camp which had a name. It was called the Kenya Parliament. And it was a Mau Mau camp with fully equipped water supply running through bamboo pipes. And this was something new to me. So I was beginning to get a different appreciation of these people from the myth which was being created elsewhere, both in Kenya and outside Kenya, that they were atavistic, unprincipled, brutal, savage, ne'er-do-wells. This was something more. One felt this was a brittle society, the settler society. It was a bit artificial, people living on the edge of their nerves very much. Then at the same time, you would have the civil service society where you were being brought up to your job as a colonial administrator, a colonial ruler, and a service which you were part of and in which you held a role and a duty and another loyalty to serve. But I was reaching out more and more to a totally different society, the African society, which had its own values, which were very different from those which I had been brought up with.
Major Ruku was eventually wounded and captured in an ambush near the edge of the forest.
Watonya kuwa thĩinĩ nĩ mũranga tũgũthondeka mũranga ũgathondeka ta gĩtanda nĩ kũheo mĩrĩngĩti ĩrĩ waheo mĩrĩngĩti ĩrĩ rĩu hau nĩho ũgũkoma ũrĩa ũngĩ nake ũguo twathondekaga handũ tandũ 12 mwena ũyũ na 12 mwena ũyũ tũgoka twendivaivu andũ amwe makanengerwo matururu magũthiĩ kwenja marima magũthikana magũthika andũ arĩa marakuĩra kũu mũgathimĩrwo akorwo nĩ marima igana rĩmwe arĩa angĩ igana rĩmwe kũu nĩkuo mũgũtinda mũkĩenja tondũ saa mũgwanja tũgacoka kũrĩa gũthiĩ kũrĩa tũkũrĩa kwarĩ gwa thĩna mũno tondũ ngima yaigwo hana nĩ bũrũri wa mũranga rũhuho rũgũka rũhurutanĩte ũguo rũgoka rũgakũmba ngima na ndũrega kũrĩa tondũ ndũrĩ kĩndũ kĩngĩ ũrĩrĩa andũ aingĩ nĩ makuire nĩ ũndũ wa mũrimũ wa typhoid nĩ ũndũ wa ngima ĩyo kũgĩo nĩ mũranga na no ũrĩrĩa tondũ ndũrĩ kĩndũ kĩngĩ ũrĩrĩa rĩu andũ aingĩ magĩgĩkua ta andũ 3,000 nĩ makuĩrĩire kũndũ kũu tondũ na rĩu ũngĩthiĩ tũburi tũrĩa twathikanagwo kũu tondũ nĩ twahorokeire na thĩ mũndũ arĩkia gũtũrĩka no umake nĩ ta kũndũ kwahandagwo kahũa tondũ nĩ bũrũri wa mũranga.
Anyone who had the slightest suspicion of ever having even taken an oath was pushed into a detention camp. Now what this meant was that the center of gravity of the campaign now moved from the forest into the camps. And the camps were very carefully controlled by the Mau Mau leaders inside them.
Ũguo mũndũ toci akarũgama ta mara merĩ kũtũhunjĩria arũgamĩte harĩa mbere o kĩrabu kĩrĩa tũikarĩte kĩrĩa andũ marĩ kĩarĩ ahunjia kĩo agagĩtũhunjĩria agatwĩra kũrario tũgakĩiguaga akorwo nĩ gũkũ andũ arĩa moragĩtwo tũgathomerwo angĩ tũkambĩrĩria kũina nyĩmbo cia kĩmaumau iria twainaga atĩ bũrũri ũyũ witũ Gĩkũyũ Ngai nĩ atũrathimĩire bũrũri ũyũ witũ Gĩkũyũ Ngai nĩ atũrathimĩire na kiuga tũtikoima kuo barĩa nyakerũ mũrĩ ageni bũrũri ũyũ no mũkoima kuo na inyuĩ raka mũkagera kũ Gĩkũyũ kĩarũrũngana.
And suddenly from Nairobi comes a telegram. I was to report immediately to the Mwea detention camps in Embu district, where I would take over the rehabilitation of the Mau Mau detainees. So I said no. Nairobi said, you cannot just say no. In a service, you have to go and look at the new posting at the very least.
Leo kwarĩkia gũkinya tara mũgwanja ũguo twarĩkia kũrĩa irio nĩ kwarehagwo andũ ta arĩa mahũraga nĩ twarehagĩrwo tũgathĩti tũmwe twa kuonania ũrĩa andũ moragĩtwo akorwo nĩ ta kũrĩa mũtitũ wa Nyandarua tũgathomagĩrwo tũgathĩti tũrauga Mau Mau maratũrũmanire na mbũtũ cia mbara maroragwo andũ 20 mũkirĩte gũkũ rĩu mũrĩ akĩgu atimia anyu na kũrĩa mĩciĩ-inĩ nĩ gũtata magũtata atimia marenda mũinũke mũcoke mũciĩ maũndũ ta macio nĩ mũtwa twatinda tũkĩhunjĩrio nĩ arũngũ ona tũkarehagĩrwo airĩtu.
There I met eventually Superintendent Cowan, and he described to me what they did, which was nothing more or less than roughing people up until they confessed an oath, and then pushing them off to another camp down what was then known as the pipeline. He didn't seem to have any problems with, any moral problems with what was being done there. To me, it seemed unforgivable and unspeakable what they were doing. He described it as nothing more nor less than a good rugger scrum. I left him with that statement and went back through Nairobi, where I dropped a note off to the government offices saying that whereas I thought I knew what was right and wrong, I realized it wasn't my duty to tell the government or something like that. But to my surprise, they posted me back to Nyeri. And this was a very important moment, because I was coming back to Nyeri changed.
Nitwaikarire kundu kuu mwaka-ini wa 1955 tukireho kundu gugwitwo Mwea, kuria twarutithagio wira wa gukuria kundu gwa kuhandwo micere, na andu ni makuaga muno ni undu wa kuhurwo na kuimwo irio, na nitwageragia gwikwo rehabilitation kuhungwo mahuri nigetha turorwo ka turiega, no andu aingi nitwaregire kumbura muma, na twarega kumbura muma nitwaigirwo detain oginya hingo ya mwisho, tondu andu ta ithuĩ twarekirio twachokire kurekio mwisho turi andu 80 na atatu andu aria marigitie detain, aria twetagwo makara, andu aria mari oru biu, tugioka gukuona mundu arehagwo na ngari agoka agateo kwao na indo ciake ciothe.
If you've committed yourself morally as well as in other ways to a theory which has led you to see people killed, see people beaten up, see people hurt, to imprison people, I think to be able to say at any point, this is wrong, we were wrong, we should change, this is very, very difficult. I'm sure that I didn't do it that easily, but for some of these other people it must have been extraordinarily difficult.
On March the 3rd, 1959, 11 hardcore detainees were beaten to death in Hola detention camp. According to the official cover-up in Kenya, they had died drinking contaminated water. Within days, the cover-up collapsed. Bowing to the inevitable, the British government in London took action and set in motion the process of independence. This included the release of Kenyatta, the so-called leader to darkness and death.
Well, by the end of that 10 years, I was informed that I had been reported to the Colonial office as someone who was disloyal. And I think it's true to say that in the course of that time, my loyalties had changed, and I was looking much more to the future, to the inevitability of a fairly rapid move to independence by the colony, and to a radical change of rulership in the country. And I myself, at that point, had decided that obviously I was going to leave the Colonial Service. I had no further role to play in it, and my loyalties had changed.
After independence, John Nottingham married a Kikuyu, who is a horticulturist.
Today I am a publisher of books, largely fiction and non-fiction, but also including children's books. I live here, and I hope to be buried here.
John Nottingham will be buried in his garden at the foot of this sacred fig tree. But what of me? I left Kenya 9 months before the capture of Dedan Kimathi and 3 years before the Hola massacre. I'm 19 years and 7 months. I return to what I wrote then. Undefended words, a letter, some notes. We sit on the edge of that gully in the Indaya Gorge for probably 5 hours, rationing our water bottles. Then over that distant bridge comes a line of British and African soldiers. No Mau Mau. Thank God, it is over. Suddenly, gunfire to our left. A lieutenant yells at us to move and we scramble through the gully, maybe 400 yards, and then up the right side of that gully. We turn and face the other side. There are Kikuyu guard in the open and amongst the bushes, escaping Mau Mau. Now, I read from my notes in that letter. With the help of the good eyesight of the Kikuyu guard, we picked targets on the hillside. By this time, more British troops were coming on the scene. We trapped 3 behind some bushes and rocks. Only one was moving, but we couldn't shoot because there were Kikuyu guards by the spot, throwing rocks, trying to chase him down. We yelled to them to get out of the way. They did. The live Mau Mau's arm was showing through the bush. The 3 of us opened fire. More troops arrived. We blazed away until an officer told us to go in and get him, if possible. We bounded across the gully and up the side of the hill where he lay. He was still alive, but God alone knows how. He must have had 20 bullets in him. His right leg was hanging off. His left leg was badly wounded. His kidneys were shattered and he had a bullet wound in his head. As I looked at him and saw what I had helped to do to him, I felt no remorse. He deserved it. The other 2 by him were in a shocking state, too nauseating to tell. I got 6 Kikuyu guards to get his body and to take him to the top of the hill. They wanted to kill him, but I threatened to shoot them if they laid a finger on him. But everyone's attention was taken away from this by a disturbance below us. In the gully, from behind some bushes, stepped 2 Mau Mau, naked, to show their lack of arms, hands raised high in surrender to the awaiting Askaris. But an Askari, though well trained, is still a man, subject to feelings of revenge, and he is still an African, a man who a few years ago was barbarous and war-making, and but for the advent of the British, still would be. The instinct of the kill is still in him, and so it was that day. Ignoring their pleas of mercy, they leapt forward and pangered them. We yelled for them to stop. They didn't. The duo turned and tried to escape, but rounds of Sten bullets stopped them in their tracks, and they fell dead. The horror of the whole day came home to me at that moment. Why must these things be? The hate I had felt for the black dying beside me dissolved into pity. I again tried to get the guards to carry him. I shall never forget the look in his eyes. He was groaning and his eyes stared into mine. It is hard to describe that look. It was a mixture of hate, pain, sorrow, and embarrassment. I hated myself as well, but all that I had done had been my duty, for death is best for them. They are animals, the Mau Mau. When this task was performed, we went to the bottom of the hill into the gully. The fighting had finished. The place was a mass of bodies. Amongst the mangled, horrifying mass of slashed, bullet-obliterated bodies was an Askari, the only casualty, with his head half severed from his shoulders. Just by me lay a dying man. One of the Kikuyu guard, as nonchalantly as if lighting a cigarette, strolled up and shot him through the brain. Our single casualty in the gorge had been the Askari with his head half severed. His Sten gun had been taken from him by Mau Mau, who had opened fire on the three of us. The bullets whistled around our heads and we hit the dirt. Just as suddenly, that firing stopped. Later, I would learn that this Sten gun, aside from a few pangas, was the only weapon that the Mau Mau had.
Mundu angiaracirwo handu mundu atangiga ni kuratwo kiongo kana githuri handu kuratwo no kagwo rio no mundu ari kuratwo nda ahota kuma haha kinyota hau atoika ni murate no ndaigua ni ndaratwo uria mundu ekaga ni kunenganira mucinga uria ari naguo akera aria menaguo ni ndaratwo kanenganira mucinga wanenganira mucinga ugacoka ukaruma tiri riu ageka tiri uguo ukamuitikira maguru riu agagicoka akagwa agakua.
What is courage?
Oh, it's a difficult question to answer. It's difficult to define, depends on the context and situations. Broadly, I'd say there are two types of courage. One is moral courage and one is physical courage. And some people who possess one don't necessarily possess the other. Very often, physical cowards have enormous inner strengths which constitute moral courage. And sometimes physically brave persons demonstrate very quickly that they are moral cowards. I don't think we know whether we are courageous people, in either sense, until we are precipitated into a situation which demands it. Very often we discover ourselves at that moment.
In the 1980s, Asru Kapila was imprisoned on trumped-up charges by enemies in the Kenyan government.
I won't say I was courageous, but I was somehow, I went through it as if I was a third person watching it happen to somebody else, which enabled me to go through it without too much anguish or agony. I occasionally paused and asked myself, how come? The curiosity to see what will happen next was so overpowering that I wasn't allowing what is happening to depress me. But I began to discover people around me suddenly, whom I had known all my lives. People were now afraid to show their association, to show their support, to identify themselves. And that is one great advantage of a crisis like that in your life. You discover truths around you which you take for granted. You begin to discover yourself, you begin to discover other people. And there is a kind of spring cleaning in your life. You come out a new man. And then they found a formula for me to utter some words in court expressing regret, and a fine was substituted. I was released. My sister, who is a very strong person, had come out from Delhi. The day I came out of prison and came home, we were sitting down to dinner. She had the prosecutor sitting with us for dinner. Completely caught us by surprise. And I understood. When she explained, she said, I just don't want you to nurse bitterness in your heart. We want to close this chapter.
Three months before my demobilization from the army, I decide to spend my final leave in Zanzibar. Another accident. On the way in Dar es Salaam, I meet an American writer, William H. Thatcher Jr., and we travel together to Zanzibar, the Isle of Cloves, the scent of which reaches our boat a mile offshore. We hitchhike to Nairobi. He has spent 6 months in South Africa writing for an American magazine. He is a great traveling companion, including teaching these boys how to play baseball. But he also speaks to me about South Africa and the sin of apartheid, officially established only 6 years before. I still hear Bill Thatcher saying that there will be rivers of blood in South Africa before the year 2000. Of course, neither of us could have foreseen Mandela, or the clerk for that matter. Bill Thatcher's openness of spirit affected me deeply, and I have often wondered what part that meeting played in my decision to leave England. The incident in Indaya Gorge had lasted a mere half hour that changed many lives. I was radically changed by the experience, but I did not yet know it. I only knew that England was no longer enough. Four months after demobilization, I bought a passage on a boat to Canada. I took my photos with me. For me, photographs are not just a record of an individual moment. They trigger my memory and open doors to rooms of people, of emotion, of events, sometimes to thoughts that lie too deep for tears. I look back through my time, through these images, and see that what I did was what young men and women have been encouraged, or asked, or forced to do, from time immemorial.
So Tommy, what are you doing with this gun?
For fight.
When you're a big man, what do you want to do?
I want to go to school.
You want to go to school?
Yes, sir.